is the recording button. So um, Pontus and I are going to discuss this topic. No, I'm not going to repeat this again. Sorry for the confusion. Anyway, we want to have a question and answers part of this discussion towards the end. And my suggestion for the way to do this is that everybody has their mute buttons on mute, and you can send your questions now or later via the chat, and I'll be reading what you're writing on the chat, and when time comes, I will ask you to pose your questions. And remember that we're recording this, so so if you don't want to be heard on the recording, you should stay quiet. But now, Pontus, I gave an extremely brief introduction. Do you want to say a little bit more about who you are and where you come from? Because I find your background to be slightly atypical.
Very atypical. Who would ever think of a mathematician who's now turning into the social impact of AI? That must be very weird for you, Olle.
So we share some characteristics, but I think when I look at what you're doing now, you seem more like a social scientist than anything else. But you did your PhD in mathematics.
Yeah, so I did my PhD in mathematics. I usually say that I'm an applied mathematician in social science, but during the last 10 years, I've become more and more social science and less mathematician. So I guess the reason I'm here is I'm head of research on new technology and social impact at the Institute for Future Studies. So I lead a research program on AI and especially near-time AI impact on society.
Yes, and that's what we're going to talk about.
Excellent.
So in order to jump straight into the kinds of questions you're studying, let me ask this very concretely. Do you think that 10 years from now, the Swedish state will have access to minute-to-minute updates of my heart rate and blood pressure?
The Swedish state, I don't know, but I think someone will. So what we're seeing right now, and I guess where your question is coming from, is a very, so we're talking about general technologies. Let's start there. And AI is the latest example of general technology. That is a technology that we expect to impact almost all areas of society. And this one is quite special. It has spread more rapidly than any other general technology. 10 years after deep learning showed that it could do something, almost everyone uses it almost every day. And the big question now for the near-term impact, I think, is what kind of data will we gather? Because the technology is already here to do lots more than it's doing right now, but it needs more data. So there's lots of interest in collecting your heart rate. There's lots of interest in collecting your data. But I don't think the Swedish government are the ones that are most interested.
So you think maybe Google will be more interested?
I think they would love it. If you would give them your heart rate data, they would love it.
Yes, but will they convince me to do it?
So far, this is very weird. So before I started studying AI, I studied norms. And in general, when it comes to norms,
social norms,
yeah, the norms that people say that they have, they tend to have. If they say that they don't have a problem with homosexuals, usually don't have a problem with homosexuals. When it comes to privacy norms, people proclaim that they are worried about privacy. When you ask them in general terms, should you leave out personal information on the internet? They say, no, you should be careful about that, and so on. But if you ask them about behavioral stuff, like how often do you avoid going to a website because of privacy concerns? Almost never. So when it comes to privacy norms, people seem to hold one norm, but in reality, they rarely act upon it.
When you say this contradicts the general pattern that they are.
In general, norms we follow what we say,
Yeah.
but with privacy, there seems to be some kind of, I don't know, laziness or some immediate utility, some happiness that we get from going to that website that just keeps us giving out this personal data over and over. Like being connected on Facebook is so much worth, so it doesn't matter that they take my data. I would prefer that they didn't, but I'm not going to change. I'm not going to get out of Facebook because of it, but very few people.
Kind of short-term convenience.
Short-term convenience seems to trump this one. Yeah.
Yeah. So concerning these
concerning, if we're rolling back to will you be convinced? I don't know about you personally, but a lot of people will probably be convinced.
Yeah.
So far, we haven't seen, at least so far. So when studying what effect alcohol has on fetuses, we haven't found where the limit is, so that there's so little alcohol that it doesn't affect. Like it's hard to find that limit. And it's similar with this case. When it comes to what type of data people are just prepared to give away, we haven't found the limit yet. There should be one, but we don't know where it is.
Yeah.
When it comes to a few specific behaviors, like watching pornography and buying drugs, people seem to want to go incognito online. But other than that, they're doing almost everything.
Yeah. And it's not hard to imagine apps that could use my biological data in ways that are beneficial to me.
Absolutely. Your biological data is slightly trickier than other data because you need a new device that tracks it.
Yeah.
And while not many have them yet, we see a lot of smartwatches and stuff that actually tracks your biological data.
Okay, we'll see what happens. You mentioned that the development here is happening very, very fast.
Yeah.
This is somewhat in contradiction to what our colleague Karim Yebari likes to emphasize. He's also at the Institute for Future Studies. He says that, okay, things are happening in AI, but when it comes to general technological change, things happen faster during the early and mid 20th century. And we actually had a slowdown in the amount of technological change we're seeing since, I don't know, 1970 or something. What do you think about that?
We might be talking about different measurements. So there are lots of things that are slower than than some people expect. So the self-driving cars keep being pushed further and further away into the future, right? We're always a few years from it. But it took the internet 40 years to reach the spread that AI has reached in 10 years. In just the number of people who are using it on a daily basis. Recommendation systems on Facebook, YouTube, Google algorithms, and so on has ensured that we use this almost directly.
Mm.
Now, all of these AIs are infused into something else. They have been plucked into things that we already had, which is why they've been able to spread so fast. When it comes to larger AI systems where you have to buy standalone products, their spread is being at the same pace as previous technology, or not very fast.
Mm-hmm. All right, and this building in AI into these services, it's a two-way communication, which I guess is essential.
It both collects data and recommends stuff for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They need to recommend stuff for us to be tempted to use them.
Yeah.
But would you say that the big thing here is the data collection?
I'm not sure I would say the big thing is the data collection. So long before AI, there have been industries whose sole goal is to change our behavior, right? The ad industry is there so that you will buy things that you wouldn't buy if you didn't see the ad. Otherwise, companies wouldn't pay for ads because That would be ludicrous if that didn't increase how many people bought their product. And this is the driving force behind the world's largest companies right now. They're using AI to suggest what you should buy, and they're collecting money from other people for doing this service for them.
Yeah.
So while they are collecting data, I would say that they are collecting data for what they think is the next step, but they're using AI right now to collect the money that they will also need to develop the next step. And I want to be clear, when I say next step, it sounds sinister, but these companies, we look at Google have something like 200 billion US dollars extra that they don't know what to spend on right now. They are on top of the world, and they just want to keep being on top of the world. So they are investing heavily in data collection so that they can be on top of next to the world. If you look at, so I have a Google Home device. This is, together with Amazon's Alexa, the most advanced AI voice recognition technology. They spent so much money developing this, it's crazy. And I can buy it for, $70.
Yeah.
Now, that's saying something. When they spend so much money developing it and they're selling it to me for $70, they're not doing it for my $70. They're doing it to get more voice connection, more voice data, so that they can keep developing this, so that they will be ahead at the next step, where they think this will be the thing that rules everything.
Yeah. Have you been following the development of the OpenAI product GPT-2 and then the next generation GPT-3?
Yeah, so loosely at a distance. But yeah.
So this is a text generating system where you trigger it with a few sentences on an arbitrary topic and in an arbitrary genre, and it will just fill in more text. And the GPT-2 which came in 2019, did some impressive things. And then early this year, GPT-3 came out and did even more impressive things. And the interesting thing about this is that GPT-3 had no significant new ideas in its design. It's just an upscaling of the underlying neural network by a factor of 100 or something. And the reason I raised this question here in connection with what you said about Google having lots of resources is that presumably Google has already resources to develop their own GPT-4 or GPT-5 thing with another couple of orders of magnitude bigger systems.
And the really interesting part of GPT-3 is that, for maybe not the first time, but certainly the best version of this is a paper that they released not on how good GPT-3 is, but how much improvement they get for adding data.
Yes.
When they try to actually map out what this improvement is. And this is going to be really interesting for how we introduce AI into society, because we want to develop AI systems. All your choices cost money. The more variables you want to include, the more money it costs to run the system. The bigger the neural nets are, the better your predictions will be. The deeper it is, the better your predictions will be, but also the more it will cost to train it, right? So starting to map out so that people, businesses and governments and so on who wants to develop an AI can get a better understanding of how much efficiency, how much error tolerance will I get with adding this much data, this much cost. So you can actually start getting a cost function to actually function. Will be important for industry to invest.
Yes. So what new products do you foresee that will change our change society and change our lives?
So I think our lives are changing, perhaps in small ways, but they certainly are changing already. When YouTube started having recommendations, we started watching more YouTube. So that's the first part. We are changing, although little. We're at the point where everyone is using AI, but we're not dependent on AI. So if we took it out of society today, we could all go about our business. Compared to if we took internet out of our lives, most of us wouldn't know how to do our jobs. We're already a society that is completely dependent on internet, I would say, but not yet on AI. So what kind of products would make us completely dependent on AI? Well, with standalone AI products. So to get a better feeling for how this works, I recently moved and I've tried to make my new home as voice controlled as possible.
Yeah.
And one thing that you find quite soon that's very frustrating about this is that voice control right now is about finding the right command to get a particular token, which is a line of code somewhere saying, turn off the light. So they're trying to match what I say, like, okay, Google, turn off the shelf lights to a particular piece of code.
Yeah.
So it's AI in, but it's not AI out. And this, I think, is going to be the first thing that changes the game, when they manage to get AI out as well. So that using things like the GPT-3 or similar, where they gather so much data that they get not an understanding, but kind of an understanding of what you want, so that they can actually, so that the AI can actually form what should be done when I'm asking things, the way that you do when I talk to you. You're not just intelligence in, you're also intelligence out. You don't have a couple of pre-written.
That's a nice compliment. Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. You don't have a couple of pre-written scripts and I'm trying to hit the right one.
No.
You're actually contemplating and addressing further on. So once they get that, then we're going to switch to voice control, I think, first of all, for all computer needs. And that's going to change society, because we have spent the last 40 years of computerization with being slaves to our computers, in the following sense. When we get a new computer system, we have to learn how to make it work.
Very frustrating.
Very frustrating, which is one of the reasons that when you see new programs, IT solutions, so on, being introduced at a workplace, it's almost always the boss who wants it, and the employees grumble.
Yeah.
Which is very weird, because if you look at other things like getting machines that help you lift patients, then it's the workers who want machines, and the bosses think they cost too much, or new fans, or whatever systems, right? But it's because of this that when a new system comes, we have to learn it. Very frustrating. But once we have a voice control that's both AI in and AI out, we don't need to learn it anymore. We just tell it what we want it to do, and it will figure it out. And we will instead switch this relationship so that we are truly masters of the computers, or feel like masters of the computers. And that, I think, is going to change the way we interact with everything.
This dichotomy for workplaces you describe, with the bosses being the ones who want to introduce stuff, and us people on the floor being against it. I think there can be other reasons beyond just the nuisance of learning a new computer system that can be bad for us. Imagine your job is to clean offices. Then it seems to be a reality at present that the working conditions for these people are getting heavier, because we have AI systems that do the scheduling of the cleaning tasks in a more efficient way, so that they get less breaks and so on in their work.
There's certainly bosses introduce things to make workers more efficient in some way that might be making the job worse for the workers. But most of the technical stuff, like a new vacuum, it will be the cleaner who wants a new vacuum that's more efficient, that lets him vacuum easier, that's more lightweight or whatever, right?
But this connects to the general issue of whether technology is enabling or replacing. And if you have a fixed amount of cleaning to do, and you get a better vacuum cleaner, then you need fewer cleaning people, right?
Yes, I mean, in the slightly longer sense, that's true. But I think, and with AI, we certainly hear a lot of people grumble about this and talk about the unemployment and so on.
Yeah.
And I think there's two things going on there. So first of all, I think we should notice that this is very nationalistic. We talk about unemployment in our country.
Yes.
But there's already a Chinese clothing factory in the US that's been going for 2 years, that is AI driven, that's making very cheap clothing. We're going to see more and more AI driven factories that make clothing. And the reason is that, okay, so we take it one step back. Before AI, robots could only handle hard material, because hard material is predictable. And this is the reason why we're making cars in countries with high salaries, like Japan and Germany, and to some extent China, because you can have few people and lots of robots. Clothing, we couldn't deal with in a robotic fashion before AI, because clothing is soft and it falls in unpredictable ways. So you need something that can perceive it and address its own actions according to what it perceives. And this is what AI can do. So we're seeing AI clothing factories popping up, which might lead to mass unemployment in places like Bangladesh.
Because they're closing down the sweatshops.
Because that would be the effect in the long run if we get these AI factories starting up. We're talking about countries that have still have a hard time getting out of poverty, and is now trying to get out of poverty by making clothes for the Western world, right? But in the Western world, we almost never talk about that unemployment. We only talk about the unemployment that might hit us. So I think that's a limit in how we talk about it. But then, even beyond that, the more important thing is it should be up to social science and politicians to deal with the unemployment, because in the long run, having machines doing our job for us is of course a good thing. Having machines that do our laundry, having machines that do so many things for us already has been fantastic for the world, fantastic for humanity. And if that leads to unemployment in the short term, we just need to fix that with how we distribute wealth, and then it is an improvement.
This is the wonderful Kjell Höglund song, Maskinerna är våra vänner. But as you said,
if they do my laundry, they are my friend.
Absolutely. But you also said we just need to distribute wealth in the right way. And I think that maybe the term just downplays the difficulty of this a little bit.
It's hard, because for many technological revolutions, the Industrial Revolution, but also the Computer Revolution and so on, we've seen a redistribution of, so the growth of the economy has been redistributed. For the growth that was caused by internet, we haven't seen a redistribution in the Western world. That's about the same time that we've seen an increase in inequality, and more importantly, we haven't seen a real increase in median wages in real term money. So the question is now.
So the economic growth ends up in the hands of the already rich. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. For the internet, that seems to be largely the case. Not for computers, not for machines, not for robots. For all of those technological revolution, the increase in economy, well, it also went to the rich, but it also went to other people in a general sense. We all grew rich. I mean, the middle class person in Sweden today has so much more than we used to before the Industrial Revolution. It's beyond count, right? So the question is, was the internet revolution the key, or was that the exception?
Oh.
And I guess so we haven't seen a large increase in the economy because of AI yet, but we're gonna within the next 10 years, and then we will see whether or not it also creates an increase in median wages, or if it's just the richest percentiles who get the money.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when I think about automation, and if we think in terms of a robot taking over the job that a human had previously, then an income from labor is replaced by an income from capital to the robot owner. And intuitively, at least, this would seem to drive economic inequality because capital is more unevenly distributed.
Yeah, but
than labor income.
It also leads to more specialized labor who can fix the robots.
Oh, but those are very few. I mean, the whole point
There
of
are much fewer,
yeah.
but one of the ways we redistribute wealth is by increasing vacation time, decreasing work week, and so on. So they become fewer, but we should also work less.
Oh, so the ideal society is where we replace all these people doing hard manual and physical, and also maybe some boring intellectual labor, with people servicing the robots doing this, but only working maybe 10 weeks a year or something. That would be fantastic.
I mean, I think so.
Yeah.
But I mean, others might have other ideals, but I think, I mean, in the more common sense version, this is how we do it, right? When if we get a dishwasher in my house, we don't go, what new work are we going to create that replaces the time we spent dishwashing? We say, okay, now the dishwasher takes care of the dishes and we have more free time.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so this is something they discussed already in the early 20th century, John Maynard Keynes and the others. What I think Keynes was the one who predicted that by the turn of the millennium, we would work a lot less. But this hasn't happened. Yeah.
I mean, so in Sweden, we reduced work time somewhere between every 10 and 15 years up until the late 70s. And then when the next time came around, which was the early 90s, we had an economic crisis and we postponed it. And then we haven't done it since, really. Depending on if you look at a work year, we reduce work time by having more time spent studying, which means that we have fewer years and we're not really increasing pension time much. So we have fewer work years in our lives then. But for some reason, we stopped reducing the work in a year time. And there are different theories about why this is. But certainly, if we want to redistribute wealth, we need to also cut down on work time, I think.
Yeah. There's this wonderful book by Yuval Noah Harari. He has several great books, but in particular in his book on 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, he discusses the topic of universal basic income as a vehicle for redistributing this wealth that we have to make it more even. And he gives a somewhat pessimistic account where he says that, yeah, I can foresee this happening country by country, that Swedish robot taxes go to universal basic income for Swedish people. But what we would really need is to do this globally, because what will otherwise happen is that most of the income will go to the United States and China, whereas Europe and the rest of the world fall so far back in the AI development that they're not going to build the AI systems and the robots that generate all this wealth. And it will be very hard for American politicians to ask from their voters that American taxes should be used to universal basic income for people in other countries.
So, I don't know. Macroeconomics is a very tricky science or very tricky phenomenon to predict. There's not a, I don't think there's a relationship at all. But if there is one, I don't think there's a strong relationship between work hours and GDP right now. The countries that have started lowering their work hours are not doing worse than other Western countries. And
You're
so
saying work
if
is
you look at
useless?
throughout the 19th century, Swedish economy was doing really well at the same time as we were introducing more vacation, a shorter work week, shorter work day, and so on.
Mm.
So I mean, it's possible, but it's also possible that once you get people who are happy with their lives and happy consumers and so on, you can keep an economy rolling on the larger intrinsic market that you get, and that will bring up less crisis in the capitalist system, and you will benefit from that instead.
That's, I mean, if this really works, if you can cut down on working hours without lowering production, that's a great thing.
I mean, you lower production to some extent, but you will increase the. We spend more money when we're free, when we're not at work.
Yeah.
So it will increase the purchasing power of the internal market, of the national market, which in turn drives lots of the industries we're seeing today. So many industries in Sweden are service industries, right?
Mm.
So they are completely reliant on the internal market. So you need your own country's citizens to have money and time to spend the money and wanting to spend the money internally to get the economy growing on the other end.
Mm. Okay, so does this lead you to be less worried than Yuval Noah Harari about this particular issue about global distribution? Well,
Potentially. There's also historical evidence that the only time we go towards economic equality is times after large crisis, wars or large other catastrophes.
yeah.
Potentially COVID could lead to some economic equality, but most of these disasters like war and so on are thankfully on a downturn, which means also that they're, to the extent that they have a generating more equal economic conditions, we need to find another way of driving those equal economic conditions. I mean, I'm not sure we have, but this is far away from our main topic.
Right.
How to handle these new machines that, if we have a few minutes, I'm going to skip away from the questions.
Yes. Yes.
Because we're nearing our end, and I want to say a few things about AI.
Yeah.
That
We have time.
We have time. Excellent. So we have this new technology, and I think it's valuable to think about what is new about it, and how will we react to this novelness. And I think there are a few things that are really new. One is that compared to other technologies, it's random, and it will feel random. It will do errors.
Yeah.
When I turn on my light, it always, well, almost always turns on the actual light when I turn the light switch. When I turn it off, it goes off again. But AI isn't built to be that. It's built to be guessing and learning from having correct or wrong guesses. So how we learn to interact with a flawed system, and which part of our lives and our society are we prepared to invite the flawed system into? That is flawed by design and might get better over time, which is why also we see this spread in YouTube recommendations, but not in self-driving cars, because it's okay if they recommend the wrong movie for me, but I don't want my car to drive off the cliff.
Right.
So error tolerance becomes very important to see where we will have an effect of this, and how we handle how our error tolerance changes when we get more used to these types of products. I think it's really interesting. So that's one part. The second part is that I think the holy grail in AI development right now that they are nowhere close to at the moment, but I know several labs who are trying, is common sense. So we talk about what is intelligence and what is the intelligence lacking here and so on. And some people talk about they can't do creativity or whatever. Well before that, AI doesn't have common sense. When it's wrong in very weird ways. Like, I might not always be able to tell, I don't know, a tiger or a lion apart in a blurry photo. But if the AI doesn't see it's a tiger, it could easily think it's a giraffe or an elephant. We don't know how those errors don't look like human errors. Because they don't have the AI, while it seems intelligent, doesn't have a proper understanding of what's happening. Which means that when you show it things that are out of the sample, it's going to react in weird ways. And handling a system that is error prone and doesn't have common sense is a novelty for us. And it's going to be really interesting to see how we interact with these systems because of that.
This common sense thing is an interesting concept. I suspect it's very anthropocentric. A machine makes weird decisions in a way that is visible to us.
Yeah.
But we probably make equally weird decisions in ways that we aren't as easily able to identify because we have these flaws in our own software.
Yeah. No, certainly. We have other connections that are natural to us.
Yeah.
But since the AI needs to interact with us to be useful, which is what's needed for us to buy it, it needs to act more according to what we think is common sense.
Yeah.
Like if it's gotten better now. When I first got voice control and I asked what time it was, or in Swedish, what is the watch? It's the actual translation of Swedish. It started reading for the Wikipedia page explaining what a watch was. Now, you wouldn't do that if I asked you what time it was or what the watch was in Swedish. And this kind of common sense, understanding what type of questions are being asked for why, is needed for us to feel at ease with them, to communicate easily, to get to the point where we have what feels like conversations.
So this is more about human psychology than about machines that objectively are good optimizers.
Yes, but they'll be it's for them to optimize taking orders from us. It's so that I can tell my robot vacuum, there's a glass that's shattered under the table, can you fix it? Rather than having to specify an area where it needs to vacuum, in interacting with some kind of interface that gives it a code, instead of being able to just understand. I should be able to just say, we have a glass fell into the floor, and my robot vacuum should say, I know what that means. That means that someone needs to clean it up. That's my job. I'll go and do it.
And these concerns underline the observation that the AI developers need our data because their machines need to understand humans, and we are the humans.
Right? Yes, so they need our data, but to do this, they actually need a very different kind of data from what they're getting right now. If you want to voice control a computer that has an understanding of what you're doing, you would want data on people doing lots of things on the computer and saying the words for what they're doing. I'm opening a document. I want to type in text and so on, so that the AI get a sense for what we're calling these actions. Now it can track my actions online, but it doesn't know what I call them. It doesn't have data. And not even if it was recording me all the time would it have it, because when I sit by the computers, I don't say out loud what I'm doing. But when I'm teaching someone, I
Yeah.
do this. When I teach them, I say, we want to do this. So I click here, so I get a new document, and then you want to do this, right? So it needs that kind of data where we're telling it what we're doing to get the concept of how our language actually interacts with our environments.
Isn't there a field where actually we provide a lot of such data, or at least people engaged in e-sporting? It's a very popular thing to have people, elite e-sporters, constantly commenting what they're doing.
And normal sport as well, right?
Yeah.
Where you're also have commentators constantly commentating what's happening on the field. So that kind of data would be much closer to getting a common understanding of what's happening there.
Yeah.
So that's a potential, but usually those areas are potentials for showing that this is possible, but it's not really in those areas where we want it.
I want to remind the audience that if you have questions, please make yourselves heard on the chat. I see no questions as yet. Here is one from my colleague, Palle Dahlstedt. Palle, you can turn on your mic and ask the question.
Yes. Hi. So you said earlier that we don't need to learn new systems. We will have when we have solved this AI in, AI out problem. We don't need to learn new systems. We can just ask them to solve things. But if we, I'm working with interaction, and can we even interact with the system if we don't have adequate cognitive models of what that system does? And I included an example. I happen to be a musician too, and we often, as musicians, hear people who know nothing about music trying to describe what they would like to hear, and it's usually completely useless. And I think there is a problem in, I mean, you can interact with a transport system like a self-driving car and say, take me to there. But it would be much more interesting if we had, and it's probably likely that we will have AIs doing things that are much more complex than that when they start to deal with knowledge and facts and whatever.
I mean, we certainly still need to keep the knowledge of what the goal is or how to get to the goal and how to add. Like, you can't just say make the music more sad. You'd have to say, you know, change it to moll. I don't know what that is in English.
Minor.
Okay.
Minor.
Yes. But what we're trying for here is something similar to what you just did. Like, I'm a new system to you. I'm a person that you haven't met before, but you can just speak in the way you normally speak, and I make a mental picture of what you're trying to get out of me, and then I respond accordingly. And you haven't learned a new system. You haven't felt like you hopefully you felt like the only thing you need to focus on was the question that you were formulating, and then it was up to me to focus on how to get the answer to you, instead of trying to find what the right button is to open a new document.
But I also have cognitive model of other persons, and that
Right.
is part of our capacity to. So you are actually a system that I know because I'm a similar system, of course, different in some kinds, but the same kind of system. But
yes,
I think there will be larger differences with AI systems.
Yes, but the first step is for them to learn how language works in quite a shallow sense, right? So that they can take orders that I just give. Instead of knowing where to click, I can just say things. And then they will be bad in the beginning. Like, they will be like children. That's fine. I can tell them when they didn't do the thing I wanted. No, that's wrong. I wanted this instead. And then they have to adjust over and over. But adjusting over and over is what AI is good at, I would say. So I'm not sure how close or far away this is. I want to say that but I know for certain that several of the largest AI developer labs are working on getting AI to this kind of understanding of a 4-year-old in taking instructions. And 4-year-olds are not great at taking instructions, but they're much better than current level AI. So getting them where a normal person who never interacted with a system before can you say what it wants and get something similar to that is where they're striving. And if
Follow-up
they succeed,
question.
that will change the game.
You're very focused on voice control, obviously, but voice is a very low bandwidth communication compared to many other interfaces we have, especially for feedback from the system back. We use the big screens that have a much higher bandwidth, and we can, to browse something is very, very hard with just voice. So
no, so for getting the information back, for seeing what it's doing, we probably want to have screens still and so on. Certainly you learn from having voice up, having Google or Siri and so on, that once it starts talking, if it's on the wrong track, you get very annoyed by how long it takes before it said all its wrong stuff. I'm focusing on voice because it's the way that we easiest communicate with each other. So it's going to be the way that we prefer to communicate, not because it's the fastest, the most efficient, but it's because what we're used to and what we do. I mean, you didn't show me a picture of your question. You used voice, right?
and a metaphor.
So is it the case that with communications involving humans, the bottleneck is our slowness in saying things, or in our outward communication, and we're much faster at getting input?
I mean, the bottleneck towards what? It's not where the bottleneck in communication with AI is right now. It's in AI's understanding, right?
Right.
But sure, if we could give it a lot more information a lot faster, that would be great. I don't know.
Yeah.
Connecting it to our brain and so on seems like such a long step away still, but I know that Elon Musk would disagree with me.
Right. Let's continue with a question from Gordana Dodeg-Sunkovic on autonomous vehicles. Gordana, are you with us? Feel free
I just have to,
Yeah.
just a second. Yeah, sure. Here I am. That's a comment about technology which is not perfect from the beginning, like the car that we have to teach what to do. And you said you don't want the car to drive out wildly, but you want to control it perfectly. What they are doing now, they have this strategy to have increasingly automated cars. So we are in control, we are responsible, and they are controlling that we are having the hands on the wheel and such things. And so the technology or the strategy is that the car is learning from us. And hopefully they will learn after some years better than we drive.
It's a hope. There's a problem again with common sense that I haven't seen a solution to when it comes to automatic cars. So if I'm out driving and I drive through a rough neighborhood, and suddenly out of nowhere there's a stop sign. There's no street coming or anything. There's just a stop sign. Like, I wouldn't stop. I would think this is wrong, and I would just keep driving. With AI cars that have studied that we stop every time we see a stop sign, they would probably stop, which would be a great way for muggers and robbers to get to you, right? So there's first we need to get them as safe as we are when it comes to normal circumstances. And we might be able to do that. We're certainly on our way. But then beyond that, how do we keep them safe in weird circumstances where our common sense kicks in? And I haven't seen a solution to that yet.
It seems that the particular problem with the stop sign that you mentioned, that could easily be fixed. But what you're getting at, I assume, is the greater problem that there are 1,000 other fixes that would be needed. And when we've done those 1,000 things, there will be 1,000 others and so on.
Yes. Getting to a point where we can have self-driving cars that can handle normal traffic, where everyone wants everything to go well, is one thing. But getting to the point where it can handle people who are trying to manipulate it, who are trying to make it break down, that's a much trickier question.
Yeah, I believe that right now it is human in the loop who helps to avoid those totally crazy situations.
Yes. But they're all going to be very rare. So it's hard to get enough data to train on them.
Yeah. But you know about this hybrid AI where people are trying to combine symbolic and sub-symbolic, because we are now in deep learning on the sub-symbolic level, and there is no reason, common sense in those. But combining with symbolic language level, they are really developing right now. So
yeah. So first of all, I'm not an AI developer. I luckily have some math background so that I can read some of their papers. But I would say it seems to me like it's always promising to get you a piece, but it also makes it rigid, and it makes it based on our understanding in a way. So it's kind of, which is also what these voice controls right now are, right? Where it's AI in and token out. It's also a combination of more traditional symbolic programming and AI programming. But it seems like the symbolic part, while it can get us a bit further than AI all the time, it can never release the full potential. Like it also locks us in. When it came to AlphaGo, the AI system that beats the world champion in Go, they found that when they first did it, they showed a lot of human games and they tried to get it a structure. But when they went to AlphaZero later on, like in the beginning, it was worse, but it had no input from humans. It had no such structure. And in the end, it got better. So there's something about as soon as we try to fiddle and try to structure things, we are limiting the potential, even if we're increasing the efficiency from our current level. But I might be wrong. Like people are much more qualified to answer that kind of question.
Moving on, awaiting further questions from the audience. Let me throw in a question here on something we talked about in the beginning of our discussion on biological data from our bodies. And I want to connect again to this book by Yuval Noah Harari on 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, where he discusses how this AI tools based on these biodata could be very efficient in making suggestions on how to improve our lives. A very concrete example he gives is that he only learned about his homosexual orientation at age 21 or something. And AI could easily, if it had been available at the time, might have been able to tell him about his orientation when he was 15 or something, and he would have had those intervening years would have been much better from him. He also talks about the kind of recommendation system they have from YouTube. If you base such system not just on what movies you have chosen to watch in the past, but also on biodata on how you reacted to various scenes in these movies and so on, they could make even better recommendations. And when he continues on the tangent, he suggests that we can have AI systems that make recommendations on all kinds of more important life decisions. Should I take this job? Should I apply for this education? Should I follow up on this ambiguous date I went to? And so on. And I remember we talked about earlier, you and I, about this, and you were more, you didn't really buy this last scenario that we would have AIs that could make such good predictions.
Yeah. So I think the first part there, when you're talking about having AI that detects things about us, is really interesting and ethically challenging in and of itself. So there are AIs that, to some certainty, can predict from writing who is schizophrenic.
Yeah.
And similar quite grave mental illnesses. And we have a mental health care that doesn't do much outreach. that usually people have to come to the hospital and say, I have problems, and then we detect them, right?
Mhm.
So it raises questions about how we, as a society, should act on such information. When should we act, and when shouldn't we act? And to what extent are people allowed to say, I don't want to be treated for this at all, even though the AI might predict that they might become violent or something like that. So that's an interesting question in of itself. But for the later part, when it comes to predicting our life, so far we have no sign that this deep learning technology can do this with almost any proficiency. Like, so my favorite research on this is a tournament based on, so they in Chicago, they have done this huge social science data collection on poor families, and they follow the children from birth, and they're 15 now, and every so often they have collected information on the child, from the parents, from the teacher, on the school, and how everything has happened in their life. And then they had this big challenge to the AI community to predict a few key things from the previous data.
Mm.
So saying the data up until 9 years old, and the next up is 15, and they were to predict, for instance, their grades when they were 15. And they did this challenge because they wanted to find out new connections, find new theories for how things develop in people.
Mm.
They really thought they would succeed, but in fact, the opposite happened. Of 450 or something algorithms that were sent in, none of them did really well, and none of them did significantly better than a linear regression with 4 variables picked just by a standard social theory. So far, there's no sign that we can use AI to predict what job will you be happy from, or what type of career should you have, or who should get extra help from the unemployment office or from the social services. And these are places where we're currently developing AI to help us. But we have no sign that AI is actually good at it.
Mm. As usual.
So to be clear, that's very different from the first part.
Mm.
So if you let an AI track your signals and so on, it would probably be pretty good at telling you that you're actually not happy in your current job, or you're actually not happy in your relationship, because every time that you have an interaction like this, or every time you do this, you actually feel worse afterwards. That's very different from telling you this is what you should do because you will be happy 5 years from now.
And you mean that we are not so good ourselves at identifying these problems? If we are going to have any use for these AI advice, they need to be better than us at pointing out what we are unhappy with.
Yes, and quite a lot better, because I think it would be natural for us to remember when they're wrong and then stop using them.
Yeah.
So it's a problem that we had with other technology companies where we tried to help, say, people in Southeast Asia with farming methods. And then if the weather goes bad a year or so on and the crops fail, they go back to the previous one. Because when we're trying out these new things, we need a real improvement to stick with it. Otherwise, we'll go back.
Time is almost up, but Palle has another question on the AI in, AI out.
Yes, first just a short reflection on what you were just talking about, because I work a lot with AI and creativity, and a lot of what you mention is closely connected with this optimization versus exploration problem. I mean, AI algorithms are designed to give you more of the same and not something hypothetically new, because giving that would require a model of the whole system, and it doesn't have that so far, and nobody has solved that. So, but no, I have more a reference question, because I wrote a book chapter this summer about agency in AI creativity, and this thing you describe as we have AI on the input but not on the output is very close to something I initially heard from a researcher at Huawei in a Facebook discussion, I contacted her, and now I don't have the name in my head. Anyway, I credited her in the text, of course. That she said that all the agency is basically still in a normal for loop, and the AI does evaluation tasks and doesn't. And it was a very striking argument. So I sort of developed it a little bit in that book chapter, but I didn't find any references on it. But this thing is very close to that thought. So I'm curious, has anybody written something, or have you, on this idea of the lack of AI out on the
I don't know if anyone has written on it. Like you, I get a lot of my stuff from AI developers. So it was an AI developer at DeepMind who first alerted me to this thing.
Yeah.
And I mean, for them, it's obvious. They already know this stuff, so they don't write papers on it.
And it was the same for me. It came from an AI developer, and
Yeah.
I found no academic papers.
No.
And
it's when it comes to us trying to predict what it affects society that we understand that this is a big deal that people don't know. But for the AI developers, it's not big enough to write a paper about because they all know this in some sense.
Yeah. Interesting. So we have the same problem there. But
Yeah.
I agree with you. It's a different formulation of the same problem I was struggling with this summer. Thank you.
Which also reaches a great problem that I try to address by having seminars between social scientists and AI developers, which is that a lot of the things that the AI developers know and take for granted is not at all public knowledge to the rest of us. And the AI developers might not realize how important this is for how it actually will play out in society, because they're not great at knowing about society. That's not their thing, right? They're great at knowing about AI development. There's a lack of communication between the two.
Indeed. Thank you.
Right, we're out of time. Do you have any final words, Pontus?
This was a lovely format. I enjoyed it. I hope the audience enjoyed it, both the ones that are currently here and the ones in the future. I feel like thinking about these things, there are so many things, like Palle asked for a paper right now, and there's so many concepts and ideas when we try to think about this potential future that there isn't time to write papers about all of them.
Right.
So it's good that we find easier ways, faster ways to communicate our ideas to each other so we can spin off them and build collectively.
Blog posts and podcasts and stuff like that. And
Yeah.
This is kind of a podcast format we're doing right now, I think.
And considering the speed of AI development,
Yeah.
if the people who are trying to look at the effects of AI development want to keep up with that speed, normal academic publishing in the social sciences is just too slow.
Thank you very much, Pontus. Thank you, Gordana, and thank you, Palle, for joining the discussions. And thanks to the rest of the audience. And we'll be back.
Thank you.